In the early 1970s, this was the road to Australia's future. A dramatic answer to the uncertainties of the Cold War. Winding through wilderness at Jervis Bay, 200 kilometres south of Sydney, this road led to the site of Australia's first full-scale nuclear power station. Details of the reactor and the reason for its demise were clouded in such secrecy that it's been all but erased from the nation's collective memory. But recently released documents reveal the reactor's true purpose was not merely to supply atomic energy. It was to be the centrepiece of a top-secret plan to fortress Australia with a nuclear arsenal. This is the story of a country fearful of its enemies and mistrustful of its allies. A nation that felt so isolated it set out to buy and ultimately construct its own nuclear weapons.
The only way in which we can protect ourselves, I believe, is by having not machine guns and rifles, but the most sophisticated scientific weapons that we can devise. And I'd put nuclear weapons in that too, and anything else which will enable one man to hold off 100.
For many Australians, the Second World War left little doubt that their country had been virtually defenceless against invasion. And without American assistance, Australia would have easily fallen to the Japanese.
Praise the Lord, pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord, pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and we'll all stay free. Praise the Lord and swing into position.
And I remember the real dangers that were felt in Australia at the time. Darwin had been bombed. Midget submarines in Sydney Harbour firing their shots out on what are the eastern suburbs. Had the Battle of the Coral Sea been lost, I don't believe we would have survived an invasion.
August 1945. The annihilation of 2 Japanese cities brought an end to a global war and ushered in a new era of uncertainty, the atomic age. For the first time, a weapon had been created that could destroy an entire city and decimate its population.
Well, it didn't come as a surprise because the Australians had been aware of the development of the atomic bomb for over 2 years. But the impact of the explosion was as dramatic here as it was elsewhere.
In 1946, Australian Labor Prime Minister Ben Chifley visited Japan. He came to see for himself the impact of the weapon that had forced Australia's wartime enemy to surrender. With every weapon in Australia's defence arsenal now obsolete, Chifley and his defence chiefs pondered how they could link the nation's future to the atom.
You have to put yourself in the mindset of people then. This terrible, terrible instrument seemingly won the war, And if it was true that the weapons were going to spread and that more and more countries were going to have them, which was the expectation at the time, then it would be hard to resist the notion that Australia, too, should have some of these nuclear weapons.
With tension rapidly increasing between the Soviet Union and the West, Australia's Minister for External Affairs, Dr. Herbert Evatt, sought out expatriate physicist Professor Mark Oliphant in London. They discussed the ramifications of atomic weapons for the British Empire.
The technical implications of the bomb, its colossal destructive power and its ease of delivery by the new methods of rocket warfare combined to convince me that if ever we are engaged again in a major war, it will mean the obliteration of our island home as an industrial centre.
Oliphant was a member of the British team that had helped the Americans create the first atomic weapons. He told Evatt of important political developments that could hinder Australia's entry into the atomic age. In particular, Britain's wartime agreement with the United States not to share atomic technology with other countries, even close allies like Australia. After the war, the trust between Britain and America quickly evaporated. Washington was now refusing to share its atomic secrets, even with the United Kingdom.
The Congress had a view that said, hey, we invented the bomb, of course, ignoring some of the British and Canadian contributions, but the congressional view was, we invented the bomb, it's our technology, it's our advantage, and we're going to hold on to it. Why should we share this with anyone else?
But Evatt returned home with some hope. With or without America's help, Britain was determined to develop atomic energy, and more importantly, its own atomic weapons. Australia, he believed, was well placed to play a part in an empire atomic program. Atomic cooperation began in 1946, when Australia joined with Britain to create a top-secret guided weapons program. The project's purpose, to develop and test rockets and guided missiles, weapons to attack both invading forces and enemy facilities thousands of kilometers away.
When the range at Woomera was first set up, the idea was that it would be used to develop a kind of super V2 weapon, that's to say, a flying bomb with a long range and one that could eventually be fitted with a nuclear warhead. And these weapons were designed to be developed over an incredibly short time frame, a totally unrealistic time frame of just 3 or 4 years.
Out of the desert grew the largest land-based testing range in the Western world, stretching from Woomera in Central Australia to the West Coast.
It's very hard to convey the sense of urgency that the British felt at this time. They really thought that Armageddon, you know, the final showdown, was literally around the corner.
The Joint Missile Project promised Australia the means to bolster her defences in the atomic age. But behind the scenes, an aggressive intelligence war between the Soviet Union and the United States was about to seriously undermine the nation's nuclear future.
The Americans had begun learning through the course of late 1946 and into 1947 that there were people in Australia working for Soviet intelligence and who were quite clearly at different times passing information to the KGB.
A top-secret US intelligence operation, codenamed Venona, identified more than 20 Australians supplying classified information to the Soviet embassy in Canberra. The material, largely from the Departments of Defence and External Affairs, was then encrypted by the embassy and dispatched to Moscow through normal post office channels. Unknown to the Soviets, British intelligence was intercepting the cables and passing them on to the Americans.
Some of the very highest classified documents in Australia, which by and large were coming from Washington and London, were being given to the Russians. We had specific situations, for example, that when the Russians couldn't get material directly from their own people in London, that they would ask their people in Canberra to request those British cabinet documents be sent to Canberra, and then they would pick them up here. So top secret British War Cabinet documents, which they couldn't get from London, they were getting from us.
The Venona affair caused a crisis in British-US relations when Washington stopped passing classified information to Canberra. Indeed, the Americans gave Australia the same security grading as the Soviet Union. Even Prime Minister Ben Chifley wasn't trusted with the details of the Venona operation. All the British told him was that his government was leaking like a sieve. And for Australia to have any hope of becoming a trusted partner in defence and atomic matters, he would have to tighten security. With the future of the Joint Missile Project at risk, Chifley set up the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation under the guidance of Britain's MI5.
The missile technology that they are developing and testing in Woomera, there's a memo goes out immediately, don't have any Australians on the high technology side of this. They can see the weapon when it arrives in Woomera, they can fire it, they can measure it and that sort of thing and give us the information, but they're not allowed to see the works of it inside it, and certainly they can't work in our laboratories. And I don't think the Australians are aware of this, so they're just part of this apparatus, but they're never included on the inside of it.
The atomic age had begun with excessive secrecy, but it was now festering with Cold War paranoia. Superpower rivalry and Soviet sympathisers within Australia had all but dashed the Labor government's atomic ambitions. Capitalising on Cold War fears and a determination to rid communism from Australia, Robert Menzies' Liberal Party swept Labor from power in late 1949. As Menzies came to office, 2 in every 3 Australians feared another global war was likely within the next decade. That year, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. And Mao's communists had seized power in China. When war erupted in Korea in July 1950, Menzies put the defence forces on a pre-mobilisation footing for World War III.
With all the goodwill in the world, and with the most heartfelt desire to make an end of war, we must be ready to meet it if it comes.
With the added fear of Japan rebuilding its military, Menzies set out to resuscitate Australia's faltering relationship with the United States. The result was the ANZUS Treaty. For the first time, Australia had signed a defence agreement in which the British had no role. But access to atomic technology, which Menzies also wanted to secure, was not part of the budding new relationship.
I don't think Menzies' broad objectives, strategic objectives, were that different to his predecessors, despite the Cold War rhetoric. The problem was, like Chifley, he found himself frozen out of this atomic club.
A major uranium find at Rum Jungle in the Northern Territory was the bargaining chip Menzies believed would finally allow Australia into the select nuclear club. In return for uranium, Menzies pressured the United States to provide the technology to allow Australia to research atomic energy.
Up until that point, he, like Chifley, had been quite enthusiastic about atomic energy. But the Americans gave him a dose of atomic realism and said, look, industrial atomic energy is way down the track, whereas the weapons option is now. And so we need your uranium now.
The American rebuff disappointed Menzies. His only comfort, Australian uranium would soon be aimed at Soviet Russia in America's nuclear warheads. In 1951, a new opportunity arose for Australia. Britain informed Menzies that it had built the bomb and was looking for somewhere to test it. With the defence of not only Britain in mind, but also of Australia, Menzies agreed to help. In return for a test site, he asked Britain to supply an industrial atomic reactor. But the British told him bluntly that atomic power and atomic weapons were part of the same equation, and they were not prepared to upset America by transferring nuclear technology to even one of their closest allies.
When Menzies asks Attlee, the Prime Minister of Britain, whether they will assist in the production of a reactor, Attlee says, well, we'd like to, but the defence implications of such a step at this stage do not allow us to take that step.
Without conditions or a guarantee of a transfer of technology, Menzies gave Britain access to the Montebello Islands off northern Western Australia for her first atomic test, codenamed Operation Hurricane. In early October 1952, Australia became the first sovereign state to sacrifice willingly its territory to test atomic weapons of another country. Britain had become only the third country to join the ranks of the atomic powers. Importantly, she was now in a better position to bargain for nuclear cooperation with Washington. Following the success at Montebello, Australia provided sites in South Australia for more atomic tests. As a member of the nuclear club, new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill said his country was now in a better position to help Australia. Anticipating British cooperation, the Menzies government established the Australian Atomic Energy Commission. In late 1955, work began on the Commission's research facility at Lucas Heights on the outskirts of Sydney. Centrepiece of the facility was a research reactor provided by Britain and paid for in part with Australian uranium. The facility's purpose included research into the medical and industrial uses of atomic energy, and the training of scientists and technicians to staff atomic power stations of the future.
This, you know, is a very historic occasion for Australia. Indeed, it's an historic occasion in the world.
The driving force of the commission was Philip Baxter. During the war, he led a British team working on the Allied atomic bomb project. In 1950, he migrated from Britain to take up a university posting, and with Menzies' backing, would help chart a dramatic new course for Australia's scientific development.
His vision of an Australia that's not just the one we know now with 20 million people, but he had this vision that there's going to be a population of the interior of Australia built up by nuclear technology. So he's going to have all these nuclear power plants. He was expecting the equivalent of 44 large nuclear power plants by the year 2000. And therefore using some of this power to irrigate the interior, create new settlements, and obviously he'd have the idea, well, we'll have nuclear weapons too, and we'll have this vast new population, and we'll be one of the great powers in the world.
With his rare mix of scientific and political acumen, Philip Baxter became a key advisor on nuclear issues to the Prime Minister's Defence Committee. For the armed services, which were grappling with the imponderables of atomic warfare, Baxter had a clear message.
Well, I'm horrified by war at all. I don't like war. I'm not a warmonger in any sense. But if you are going to defend yourself in a country where the enemy will undoubtedly outnumber you by 10 to 1, then in my view it's wicked to send young men and young women out to fight armed with archaic weapons and inadequate training to be slaughtered in the field. In a situation where what is at stake is survival, any method is justified in my view.
Baxter's ideas found support within both the Defence Forces and the government. Senator John Gorton, an ex-World War II fighter pilot, called for a nuclear-armed Australia rather than place its trust in the deterrence held by Britain and the United States.
He took to the floor of the Senate and argued that Australia should have its own nuclear weapons, its own rockets and missiles to deliver those nuclear weapons, and asked the question, putting an Aussie twist on French thinking at the time, asked, would the U.S. sacrifice San Francisco for Sydney? He doubted that.
In early 1958, during the first visit to Australia by a British Prime Minister, Menzies agreed to explore the possibility of arming the nation with atomic weapons.
I'm very glad indeed to be here today on a visit to Australia.
In preparation, the Prime Minister's Defence Committee met at Victoria Barracks in Melbourne. Two options were on the agenda. The first, request the transfer of British atomic weapons to Australia. The second was an extraordinary proposal from the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Philip Baxter.
Well, Baxter is a brilliant and crafty fellow, and he recognized that Macmillan's visit, coming to Australia, represented a golden political opportunity to advance his agenda and the agenda of the Australian Atomic Energy Commission. And his proposal was one that was intended to both pull in the British and pull up the Australians to the point where they would collectively be involved in a nuclear weapons program.
Baxter wanted Britain to help fund and build a nuclear reactor near Mount Isa in Queensland, close to the new Mary Kathleen uranium mine. The plant would be of similar design to the world's first power reactor, which had recently opened at Calder Hall in Britain. Fueled with natural uranium, it would provide power for Australian industry. And its byproduct, plutonium, would be exported to Britain for her weapons program. Importantly, Australia would also be able to use the plutonium to make its own atomic weapons, which Baxter argued was well within the nation's capability. The Defence Committee agreed Baxter's proposal had important defence significance. But more information was needed, especially how much it would cost.
Now, there is a debate, and obviously Baxter wants to pursue both options, but given that Macmillan is likely to defend the arrangements with the United States, the Chiefs of Staff successfully argue that we will talk to Macmillan about the acquisition of British atomic weapons.
Menzies starts out, and I must say he starts out with a sort of soft approach. He says, well, I don't know how you feel about it. I sort of have my own personal qualms about this, but how would you feel if Australia got nuclear weapons? Maybe you could transfer us nuclear weapons. You know, I'm getting an awful lot of pressure from my Atomic Energy Authority on this. We're not ready to do it today, but what do you think about it? And having gotten that sort of soft request, Macmillan followed in kind and said, well, I'm not sure we can really do that. You know, the Americans are quite difficult about this. This is a very sensitive time. They're thinking about revising the McMahon Act, which imposed these restrictions on the transfer of nuclear technology. It looks like we're going to get a change in that law that will open things up so that we can get greater access to nuclear weapons. But the most that's given at this point by the British is a commitment to talk about nuclear strategy. No information about nuclear weapons, no technical information, no nuclear weapons transfer outright.
Despite unwavering assistance to Britain's atomic program, Australia was still out in the cold. Soon after, Macmillan announced Britain's relationship with America had improved, and she would now conduct most of her atomic testing in the United States.
Britain, of course, got their bomb. They also got what they wanted and joined back with the Americans and started testing at Nevada. And what did Australia get? Hundreds of square kilometres of plutonium-contaminated land, which they still have, but no bomb. Crazy.
Adding insult to injury, the Woomera Joint Missile Project was soon in crisis. By the 1960s, Australia had invested heavily in the development of nuclear-capable delivery systems, expecting Britain inevitably to supply the warheads.
Negative, I think we'll be all right as we are now, thank you.
Australia's defence forces were especially interested in the Bloodhound Mark III ground-to-air missile.
And so they actually purchased that weapon, purchased a nuclear-capable weapon. And it was the British understanding, the British documents show, that in purchasing this missile, they would also be able to get the warheads to fit on that missile. Now, as it turns out, for reasons completely unrelated to anything having to do with security, the Bloodhound program was canceled. The British Treasury put it on its hit list and canceled the program before any of the nuclear version were transferred to Australia.
Soon after, Britain axed the Blue Streak nuclear-armed ballistic missile, which Australia had also helped fund. In the end, the Empire atomic program had proven little more than a pipe dream. Hundreds of millions of pounds were spent at Woomera, yet none of the weapons developed there were used for the defence of Australia.
It's ironic, really, that a project that was conceived as being, a joint project between equals, in fact, as things worked out, exposed that Australia, in this respect, was merely a client state of Britain's. It did what was required. It built the facilities that were required. It put the manpower, the energy, the money into activities that basically benefited Britain and nobody else, and was happy to do it. So it really is, I suppose, an expose of the true nature of the relationship between the two countries.
By the early 1960s, Britain's commitment to defending Australia from its base in Malaya was waning. And with nuclear weapons likely to spread to Southeast Asia in the near future, defence became a major election issue.
The real issues in defence are these. Have we got the planes, the ships, the men, and the equipment to repel aggression?
The Labour opposition questioned the nation's ability to hold back invasion forces from China or Indonesia. Indeed, under President Sukarno, Indonesia was flirting with both the Soviets and Communist China.
Of 600 warplanes, Indonesia has 3 squadrons of bombers, one of which can carry a nuclear bomb from Jakarta to any Australian capital city.
Facing growing public concern, the Menzies government placed an order for America's nuclear-capable fighter aircraft, the F-111, to replace its aging Canberra bombers.
It was never a secret at any time within the defence establishment, and even for that matter in the Australian press, that it was essentially an acquisition which was going to be used against Indonesia. Given that we only had 25 of them, the amount of impact they could have had carrying conventional weapons on any target from Indonesia was infinitesimal. So what really were they meant to be carrying? And by deduction, although I'm not aware that the government ever said it publicly, for obvious reasons, the real purpose was in fact to carry a high-performance bomb, a nuclear weapon.
Indeed, in the early 1960s, Australian military strategists were planning for nuclear war in Southeast Asia. To assess the impact battlefield nuclear weapons would have on jungle warfare, the Army and Australia's defence scientists devised an extraordinary experiment codenamed Operation Blowdown. The site they chose for the project was the Iron Range region in far north Queensland. They had no actual atomic weapon, but the scientists considered 50 tons of TNT would adequately simulate a small tactical nuclear bomb.
Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The experiment revealed that a nuclear blast in jungle would create such a tangled mess of vegetation, the movement of troops would be seriously impeded. But the confidential documents behind Operation Blowdown offer a more important revelation. The Australian Army in the early 1960s believed that the next war they would face could involve tactical nuclear weapons, used by or against an Asian enemy. That belief was given weight when Red China became the first Asian country to join the select nuclear club.
For Australians, yes, there was a Soviet threat, or at least a perceived Soviet threat. Yes, there was concern about Indonesia. But at the end of the day, it was the Red China threat that occupied the imagination of Australia and of military planners. And so we see that after the Chinese bomb, there is a renewed interest in nuclear weapons in Australia. And while in the 50s, the focus had been on procuring nuclear weapons from the UK or from the US, now it was a different situation. For the first time, you have discussions of Australia developing its own indigenous nuclear capability, of it building its own bomb.
In the summer of 1965, Australia took its first steps towards building the bomb. The Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, asked the Atomic Energy Commission to advise the government on the costs of producing nuclear weapons. In the Commission's top-secret report, Philip Baxter confidently predicted Australia could manufacture as many as 30 tactical nuclear weapons a year. As the report was delivered, Australian troops were fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, and Indonesia was boasting that it would soon have the bomb.
Indonesia will fight for her freedom to the death, and if necessary with atom bombs. So said President Sukarno in his Independence Day speech on August the 17th.
With the retirement of Sir Robert Menzies in January 1966, the nuclear weapons issue passed to a new Prime Minister, Harold Holt. Holt immediately backed far-reaching changes to the Atomic Energy Commission's research program. From now on, Lucas Heights scientists would attempt to make Australia as self-sufficient as possible in every aspect of the nuclear fuel cycle, and avoid international scrutiny and restrictions on defence-related research. Holt also supported a top-secret uranium enrichment program, which, according to Baxter, could deliver weapons-grade nuclear materials. But the only public hint as to Holt's thinking was a controversial decision to limit exports of uranium. Mining companies would now have to stockpile half their reserves for future Australian needs. Its intended use is dramatically revealed in a document secreted away in the archives since May 1967. The document's author is Philip Baxter. Baxter urges the minister overseeing atomic matters to prevent the sale of 5,000 tons of uranium to Britain. The reason? To ensure Australia had enough uranium to manufacture a limited number of atomic bombs. Baxter promotes using the uranium to power a civil reactor, which would create the plutonium needed for the weapons.
In this document, Baxter appears to be gently reminding the minister that perhaps the best way to achieve their ends is to focus not on nuclear facilities for solely military purposes, but instead to go down the path of building a nuclear power plant that on the surface would be a plant whose purpose was to provide electricity. But that station provides you with the stuff for making bombs.
Following Holt's disappearance while swimming in late 1967, the push for an Australian bomb gained even greater impetus. Holt was succeeded by outspoken nuclear advocate John Gorton. On the very day Gorton was sworn in, Britain announced it was withdrawing all its forces from Asia. Three months later, the United States announced a de-escalation of the bombing of North Vietnam. The resolve of both Australia's major allies to fight communist expansion in Southeast Asia had clearly weakened. Australia, it seemed, would soon be standing alone in an increasingly dangerous region.
That started generating people thinking, even actually before the formal announcements, there were people in defence thinking, well, what do we do if our major allies on both sides withdraw?
Suddenly, Gorton looked around and wondered if Australia was going to be on its own. He wondered whether it was really worth it to be sending Australian boys to die in Southeast Asia for someone else's wars. And that as he looked out, he had a different concept. Rather than forward defense, which was the strategic concept that had dominated Australian military planning for decades, he offered a different model. It might be called the Gorton model. Withdraw from the region, build a fortress Australia, depend on nuclear weapons, because you can't depend on it.
In 1969, Prime Minister Gorton stunned the international community. He announced Australia would not sign a proposed nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which required nations to renounce the nuclear weapons option for all time. Soon after, his government approved Australia's first full-scale nuclear power station. It was to be constructed on Commonwealth land at Jervis Bay, 200 kilometres south of Sydney.
This was Baxter's great dream. Whether Australia needed it, of course, is a moot point, and it's been proved that it hardly did.
The decision came under little scrutiny, even though Australia's coal reserves were at an all-time high. And with coal power far cheaper than atomic energy, the reactor made little economic sense.
Whereas many cabinet submissions could come in at 20, 40 or even 60 pages of argument, this submission came in and it wasn't really an argument, it was a bold statement which basically said Australia needs to have a nuclear power station at Jervis Bay. There was no examination of the use of this for civil energy production. That was completely missing. And it left me with the idea in my mind at the time that what on earth would you want a nuclear power station in Jervis Bay, of all places, which is a long way away from any population centre. And the only conclusion I could come to was that you wanted it for nuclear material, possibly for nuclear weapons.
It's only in recent weeks that Commonwealth Police have screened everyone entering the headquarters of the Atomic Energy Commission here at Coogee in Sydney. Now, this security might be necessary, but according to some people, both the Commission and the government have thrown an unnecessary blanket of secrecy around the Jervis Bay project.
It was never openly discussed, and this caused the Labor opposition to become increasingly worried about it and to begin to ask questions in Parliament and express concerns, but these questions were never answered. It was one of the times in policy making when secrecy was rampant.
Back in March '68, you urged Australia to acquire, quote, the most sophisticated and effective weapons man could devise, end of quote.
Yeah.
Do you think people can really dissociate a statement like that from the decision to go ahead and build nuclear power stations which will produce plutonium which can be used in the manufacture of bombs?
Well, the decision to build the power station, of course, is a decision of the Australian government. The remarks you quoted made by a Vice-Chancellor speaking his own personal views were purely personal opinion. And actually what I was thinking of at that time was bacteriological and chemical warfare. Both of which I regard as being well within Australian capability, and things which, if I were in charge of defence, which I would say, thank God I'm not, I would be looking at very hard.
Prime Minister Gorton denied the reactor had anything to do with atomic weapons. But within the government, there was dissent. Foreign Minister William McMahon had serious reservations about Gorton's decision not to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which aimed to limit the spread of atomic weapons. McMahon argued that the country's reputation was at stake and that there would be international pressure to deny nuclear technology to Australia if it didn't back the treaty. For the sake of the Jervis Bay project, Gorton grudgingly signed the treaty, but indicated that Australia would not be bound by the agreement until it was backed by every other nation. In March 1971, Gorton was forced from the Prime Ministership to be replaced by William McMahon. 5 months later, McMahon suspended the project for a year and then cancelled it completely. 3 years later, in a letter to a newspaper, McMahon revealed why he scrapped the reactor. It was more than its economic viability. He was also concerned that it violated Australia's obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
So, of course, this is a rather curious statement, because the essence of the NPT is that you can build a civilian reactor. In fact, that's what you're getting in return for having given up the military option. And so that's led some to speculate that the real meaning of that statement was that the Jervis Bay reactor was intended to produce material for nuclear weapons.
I think Baxter was quite right in his analysis of the situation. He thought that we should have a civil nuclear plant in Australia, but he also thought that it was able to shorten very materially the time necessary to make nuclear weapons.
He was furious. As someone said, he fought like a tiger for Jervis Bay. He did everything he could to persuade, but because he'd lost the inner ear of a Prime Minister, he wasn't in such a formidable position. His view was then and always that the expert must in the end be trusted. Therefore, he said this is not a matter for the ballot box or for public participation or even public discussion. Most people know nothing about the technology, therefore the expert must be trusted.
After he retired from the Atomic Energy Commission in 1972, Sir Philip Baxter finally revealed publicly what was behind his push for the bomb. He warned that the Australian way of life would not survive without fortressing the nation with weapons of mass destruction.
The world is set on a major collision course with disaster, and that it's going to strike probably around the end of the century or just after. We may very well see, if it goes through nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere, which is likely, that hemisphere made virtually uninhabitable for some time. While a lot of people say, well, you know, this is the end of the world, I don't believe this is so. And I think that Australia will have a better chance than most other places of coming through successfully. But we will, in such a situation, clearly be like the one lifeboat from the big liner that has sunk and it's full, and all around in the water are many, many people trying to clamber on board, and if you let them, you all sink. You've got to just batter them off, keep them away, and look after your own survival. The only way in which we can protect ourselves, I believe, is by having not machine guns and rifles, but the most sophisticated scientific weapons that we can devise. And I put nuclear weapons in that too, and anything else which will enable one man to hold off 100. We could undoubtedly arm ourselves with atom bombs twice the size of, say, the Hiroshima one, without too much difficulty if we were to devote the effort and the money to doing it. It would take some years to do, but I would have complete confidence in our ability to do it if that were in fact the government's policy.
Australia, in the end, didn't heed the call for a nuclear arsenal, despite a mistrust of both its allies and potential enemies. In 1973, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. By the mid-1980s, Australia was a leader in the cause of global nuclear disarmament.
If Australia had developed nuclear weapons or procured nuclear weapons from the British, this certainly would have given bomb advocates in Indonesia and in Japan a leg up in their fights to preserve nuclear options in those countries. It would have weakened confidence in a treaty system whose intention was to restrain the spread of nuclear weapons. But arguably, the most important consequences would have been for Australia itself. When you build nuclear weapons, you get a big secret apparatus. An apparatus that's difficult for civilians to understand, for civilians to control, and an apparatus that puts an entire nation at risk. I think it's those sorts of costs, the democratic costs, that might have been very real for Australians.
I don't think that anywhere in the defence community now there's any hankering after the nuclear option. But I think the one trigger which would cause Australia to go nuclear would be any indication that Indonesia was going nuclear, but also any indication that we were facing a real serious confrontation with Indonesia.
The whole assumption in staying your hand in the production of these weapons, given the international climate, is that the Americans will indeed use their nuclear umbrella on your behalf. Now, we've yet to see that tested. The Australian calculation would be, in my estimation, that we want to have the capacity to develop our own bomb quickly in the event that the Americans are not forthcoming, having the option for a delivery system and ultimately the production of the weapon to go on such a system in the future. I think it's fair to assume that that capacity is still on the books.